Hello, everyone. Welcome to My Week at the Club, episode number 31. Bringing you the action from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. And this week I played against Dave Couture in a game that had sort of a interesting occurrence that happened right near the end of the game and ended up actually being decisive for how the game turned out. And it was a fairly long game, so I will not try to analyze every single move in the game and explain my thinking because that would just take us too long and you'd probably get bored and turn off before the climax of the game. But before I get started, here below the picture of Dave is a nice spiral galaxy seen just about edge on. And it's just kind of a placeholder picture for me to introduce a topic that I think is a kind of a common misconception about space. And this goes along with some of the issues of lighting that I've talked about last week and a couple weeks ago. And that's the question of whether or not space is light or dark. Now, when people think about space, they think of, our view of it at nighttime, it's dark. And therefore you go out and space is dark. You see all these stars. So is space dark or not? Well, it depends very much on exactly where you are. If you're in the vicinity of a star, space is very light. And, the sun is shining virtually everywhere about the distance that we are from the sun. It's very bright, except for a few little places that are in shadow on the backside of solid objects. But that's really a very small amount of space. So almost everywhere in space, it's just bathed in daylight that's brighter than noonday sun in the tropics. And so it's very much location dependent. And as you go away from the sun, obviously, as I spoke about last week, it gets a bit dimmer, but not as dim as people think. But by the time you get to the distance between the stars in that region, then it really does get dim. And if you get into the region between galaxies, it gets even dimmer. In fact, it's even worse than people talk about in science fiction novels, where they get between galaxies and look down on the glorious spiral galaxy of the Milky Way. But in reality, it wouldn't look like that from between galaxies because the Milky Way is so dim that it would be, just a fairly dark, a fuzzy patch for your eyes. It wouldn't be a bright, shining thing. These pictures that you see that are taken with instruments like the Hubble Space Telescope or Keck or whatever, Gemini, are all long exposures that capture much more light than your eye could ever hope to and make it look a lot brighter than it really is. One other thing I wanted to mention was that even on the surface of the moon, you're not going to see stars on the daylight surface of the moon. And the reason for that is because the sun is very bright. It's true even on the surface of the moons of Jupiter. The sun is still very bright there. And it's so bright that the light that shines on the surrounding ground around you, even if you're looking away from the sun or if you're standing in the shadow of a boulder or something, the light that shines is reflected from the ground around you is so bright that it would cause enough scattered haze in your visor that you wouldn't be able to see the stars. And it's basically whenever the daylight is shining, it's going to be pretty hard to get that image, the classical image of space that you always see in science fiction movies or read about in books. Anyway, enough of that. I'll move on with this Dutch Leningrad that I played against Dave. And he actually took me a bit by surprise. I haven't had to face too many of these in my short tenure as a D-pawn player. And so, as usual, I ended up spending a fair bit of time working my way through the opening. And I'm just going to zip right through the opening moves here because these are all mainline theory. Well, so up to this point, this is all very much mainline. Then for White's eighth move, there are a whole raft of possible lines. Some of the most popular are d5, Um, getting a better grip on the center and keeping the knight from developing through c6 and restraining the e-pawn from advancing. I didn't like that because it activates his bishop on that dark square diagonal. What else is popular? Rook e1 to support an e4 move. There were about a dozen different moves that were popular. The one I chose, e4, is a pretty rare visitor in master play. And I looked at it, and it just, I didn't see anything wrong with it. I thought I should play it in order to improve my share of the center. And it looks like I'm losing a pawn that is not defended enough, but of course I'll get it back because it's hard for him to hold on to that pawn once he takes it. He chose to take first with the knight, so I have to play knight takes, pawn takes. And then after knight g5, I suddenly have two attacks. The knight and the bishop, of course. And he has 0 defenses, so he could defend with a piece, but he can't. The only way you can hang on to a pawn in a situation like that is if you could defend with another pawn. And then the fact that it's being attacked twice doesn't help. But he can't defend with this d pawn because I would just take it right off with the c pawn. So basically I'll win that pawn back, and if he pushed it, I could take with the bishop. So this was what I had in mind when I played e4. Now he can delay my taking back of that pawn with knight c6. And now this is actually where we leave the book. There were only a few games that were played with this e4 line, but this defending the pawn with bishop to e3 was not the continuation that was chosen. So from here on, this is a novelty and we're in new territory. But it seems a sensible move to me, and it's the one that the computer recommends in this position too. So, okay. Dave continued with e5. I attacked, right here I expected the knight to come into d4, and my plan was to let it sit there for a while because I can't actually end up winning it. But at some point, if it comes into d4 here, at some point I'll trade off this bishop for the knight when I need to, and then try to win this, encircle and maybe win this pawn that's on d4. But clearly I wouldn't do it right now because it's too well defended by the bishop and the pawn together along the diagonal. But he didn't do that. He went back to e7 where the knight is less exposed. It's a less ambitious move in some ways. So I went ahead and took the pawn back. He attacked my knight. It's okay because it's defended. And so I just continued to develop here. It's noontime. There's the wall clock owling at me. And he played b6. The threat, of course, was to play c5. I had looked at a couple of ideas here. Idea of playing on my previous move and playing b4 followed by c5, or an immediate c5 on the previous move. And part of the reason I did this was back in this position, it just seemed like it was premature to push c5 right away. He could always trade the knight off and then retake his d pawn with his c pawn. So I wasn't really threatening to win a pawn there. And it seemed like a better idea to get my rook off of this long diagonal that the bishop is on so that there wouldn't be any future tactical ideas involved with that, and also to get the rook into play along the c-file. But so he played b6 and prevented that. The computer was not a big fan of this move. So at this point I played knight c3 for a couple reasons. One was to keep it from getting traded off by the bishop, because I actually like that knight on its post better than I like his white squared bishop at this point. The bishop, let me go back a move. In this position, the way I analyze it is that he's having a hard time developing his pieces. This bishop is keeping his knight from moving, and he's probably not wanting to trade the bishop for the knight, even though that might be the best move at this point. and he just doesn't have a lot of good squares for pieces to go to. So what I did was to retreat the knight so that it couldn't be traded off for his bishop, and that way it makes his development continue to be difficult. And what's more, I'm threatening the idea of knight b5 with a possible capture on c7. The problem is this is really easily parried. He played queen to d7, and now I'm never really going to get anything on that move. If I go to b5, he can just chase me away with his a pawn. So I realized that none of my ideas I was looking at were really working on the queen sides. So I decided to bring my knight back to the king side. Definitely not an optimal sequence of moves here, but the other thing that I realized, I see my note reminds me, is that I was worried about bishop to e3 at this bishop to h3. After I put the queen on this diagonal, there's a real threat now of playing the bishop to h3 and trading off this light squared bishop on g2, which would make my king's position weaker now with this fianchettoed pawn structure. And this move prevents that, at least for a while, because if he played an immediate bishop to b3, I could just trade off the bishops, play my knight to g5, attacking the queen. The queen would have to retreat somewhere. d7 is a good square. And then my knight gets into that e6 square that I've been eyeing for a while. So that's all very nice. It does prevent him from going immediately to h3, but the problem is it doesn't prevent him for very long, because Dave just simply played h6 himself, and now my knight's not going to be able to come to this g5 square. And I couldn't really see any way at this point of preventing bishop to h3. So I went ahead and just tried to improve my pieces. I attacked his h-pawn a second time. He defended it with his king. And then for lack of anything better to do, I played this sort of active move f4. My computer is so-so on this. It doesn't think it's a good move, but it doesn't really think it's a bad move either. But basically, white has a difficult time finding a plan. So after f4, we traded off those pawns. The bishop came into h3. Now, I don't want to take it and invite his queen into my position. I would rather have him initiate the exchange. So I just made a small improvement to my position to shore up my queenside pawns, especially now that the light square bishops are going to get traded. I don't mind having my pawns on the light squares. He does do that trade, and then comes with his knight into the position. I started to see some combinatorial possibilities here, but I wanted to shore up my knight first, because the undefended knight could, in some of the lines, could be a possible weakness. So I defended my knight, and he put his rook on the file to attack it again, but at least now it's defended. And I played h3 to take away this g4 square from him, and also to make a square a better pocket for my king to go into. In this position here, was feeling a little too exposed along the white squares, and now I can tuck in on h2 at some point in the future. He played his bishop to e5, offering in the trade. I wasn't really interested in that. I thought about it for a little while, because it looked like maybe there was a combination. So what I was looking at was to take his bishop, and he takes back with a rook. And now this is leaving his rook undefended on f8. And that was the idea behind this possible combination. And then I could attack this knight that when it moves, it looks like it's pinned to the rook. When it moves, I could take his rook. But the problem is that his knight could go somewhere where it checks my king. And if I want to keep this combination alive, I'd have to go and attack his knight, because You know, I need to keep the tempo on my side in some sense. But he could just trade off the rooks and then take my knight. And then to maintain material equality, I'd have to take his knight. And then h5, and all of a sudden he's the guy that's got the better position here. So I didn't like this. You know, the original move here, bishop takes e5, looked like it was promising, but it kind of failed because of the check to my king. So what I did instead was to play my king to h2 in order to prepare that move so that there wouldn't be a checking move with the knight. But of course that gives him time to trade the bishops, which he did, and I took back with the rook. Could take with the queen. I wasn't a big fan of that move, but it's not a horrible move either. Okay, he redeployed his queen through the dark squares here with this maneuver to go to g7 with the idea of, you know, at some point, whoops, not doing that. Instead, coming down here over to the b2 square if I should vacate this rank, or any of these squares on my queen side if I don't protect them, any of these dark squares. So it does help him to take over that diagonal. And what's even more important is it supports this d4 square for his knight to get into, or possibly his queen. So I think that was the thinking about the move. And at this point, I looked at the idea of playing my e-rook to f1, which was a nice, strong possibility. But I decided not to do that. I mean, it looked nice and solid. But instead, I went in for a tactical line that looked like, at least in some of the variations, that I was going to be winning material. And I couldn't see any of the variations that lost material for me. So I went in for it, even though it really loosened up my position. And that was to play g4, attacking this pinned knight. And there's several possibilities. Like one possibility would be that he came in with the queen to d4. You know, if I traded queens off, then the knight would just recapture. But that's bad because that would allow me in this situation to have a discovered attack on the queen with knight to g5 check. He takes it and I win the queen. Also, in this position, it'd be bad for him to play the queen to e5, which I sort of half expected because it looks active because it's pinning that rook on f4 to my king. But part of my analysis was that I would still play knight to g5 check. He would take back. I would take his queen. And I was thinking he'd play rook takes rook, which would be bad for him. There's actually a better move, pawn takes. Now attacking my rook, and my rook has to move, which gives his knight time to redeploy. But this is still a bit better for white. It's just not as much better as it would have been if he played queen d4. But he did neither of those. Instead, he played his knight to d4. And this turns out as a good move, because even though it looks like I'm winning the exchange, I'm not really, and I have to be prepared to give it back, otherwise I'm in a world of hurt. And the way the line goes is that he just goes ahead and takes my knight, and I have to, there are various mistakes I could make here, but the best line, the forced line, is for me to go ahead and take his rook. And that allows him to come in and play the knight to f3 check. I have to take the knight with my rook, and he takes it back. And now, as you can see, we've traded material, and it's just even. If back in this original position, if I played, say, queen takes knight, that wouldn't be good because of let's see. Yeah, just because he, In this case, he'd just go ahead and take my rook on e1. And, however, I take his rook here. It's even material, and his rook is now in my house here, coming after my king with potential checks. Things such as rook here, and now blocking with the rook would be a real mistake because the queen takes queen. That sort of thing. So I didn't want to have any of that. So the way I played it, I think, is really the only way to go about it. And so I took the rook on e8, he checked, I took it back, and he took back. And now it's even material, but I figured I had a little slightly more aggressive rook posting. I came after his rook hoping that I could chase it back. I was really expecting his queen to go to f7 here. I'm not really threatening to take the rook because he can then just, even if it was my move, after king takes rook, he could just check me on this square, and I'd be forking my king and my rook and win the rook back. But instead, he retreated the rook, which I was happy to see. That allowed me to take over the e-file. He put his queen into a more aggressive post, which I think was good, but that I was able to come back and attack it. Now, in this case, he wants to. I expected him to go back to g7, but he actually instead, because he wants to keep a control of this e7 square, so my rook doesn't infiltrate there. Instead, he played queen to g5, and I offered the queen trade. And at this point, he went ahead and took it, and I think I get into a slightly advantageous endgame. Now, one thing I meant to show you, which I didn't, see if I can get it up here on the screen, is, no, maybe not. Hopefully this doesn't destroy the recording. So this is a screenshot of the Lichess.org where I dump the score of the game into, and you can have it do an automated analysis and give you the result of the computer's idea of what the score in the game is. And we played a very even game all the way through into the end game. And we're not yet at this big mountain here where Dave committed an oversight. But other than that, things had stayed very even. And I thought my position was better than it really was, to be honest with you. And other than this region here, which I gave the advantage back to him, you'll see how I did that. And then at the very end of the game, where there was an oversight by him, it was extremely even game. So we'll come back here, see if I can reorganize my windows to show you what's happening in the game. So after king g7, I played king g3, and as I was saying, I thought I actually had the upper hand at this point, even though the computer doesn't really agree so much. Okay, he played g5 to prevent my further infiltration on the king side. I played h4. We traded off the pawns, and now he improved the position of his pawn on the a-file. Okay, I came up with my king. Now I'm actually threatening to, in some variations, to win that h-pawn. And he played his rook to f2, and I was able to check him. And interestingly, now we're getting down into serious time pressure. Me especially, but eventually Dave catches up with me in time pressure. And I had a couple of bullets that I had to dodge here. And going into this variation, I had to actually see that there was a way to dodge the bullets. And so my rook is under attack, and he's actually threatening checkmate right now. So for example, if I played rook takes pawn in this position, he could simply mate me on h2. Wouldn't want to have that happen. So instead, after you attack my rook, I have the move rook to e6 check, which is a good move because it allows me to win the h-pawn. His king moves. He goes ahead and defends the king. I check him again, and he has to move it. And now I can win the h-pawn, and it frees up, not only wins the pawn, but frees up an escape square for my king. Okay, now he takes the pawn, and this was the place where that mountain of advantage was coming over to White's side. So the problem is that after he brings his rook over here to my king side, he has a hard time stopping this g-pawn and ends up having to invest major material to do it. And a better strategy at this point, after I took the pawn, was actually just to play king g7. Now, of course, he's threatening to win the rook with rook h2 check. I couldn't have that happen. I would have to do something like rook to e6 to move it to safety, and then he just moves his king back, and my rook doesn't have a way to penetrate into his position. Instead, after he plays rook takes a2, okay, so rook takes a2. Now I can check him, and after his king moves, I'm able to run rampant here on the 7th rank. Now I can't do it immediately because it's the same as before. If I take that pawn, I get checkmated because he has very nicely covered. Well, his king plus my pawn is a obstacle here. If I've taken away all the escape squares here along the g file, and so I got to be a little bit careful of that. And instead, I saw as I came into this that I had g5 check. His king has to move. Mate is still threatened. I check him again though, and now he has to move off of the f file, and that gives my king safety. And that was what I was thinking in my mind, and I thought I was being fairly clever, but in reality, the clever thing to do in this position right here was not to play my king to safety, but to advance the g-pawn because it's so close to queening. And basically, it's very hard for black to stop it. And this is why this variation would have been so good for white. He can come and check me, but so what? I go to the g file. If he checks me again, I go back to the h file, but one square further on. So if he checks me, I go in front of my pawn. And basically, he's going to have no way to stop that pawn without sacking the rook. And his king is still a long way from creating havoc here on my queen side. So that would have been a good line for me in this position, pushing the pawn, but instead I sheltered the king right away. But now my king is in front of my g-pawn, and that slows it down. I'm going to end up using 2 moves, and because my king got in front of the pawn, and then it's going to have to get out from in front of the pawn. So that cost me 2 tempi. And also, his rook is over here on the queen side where it can cause significant damage. And so it was not a good move, but didn't throw the game away yet. So he played a4, which in the position I think was strong. I took, which is okay. He took back. And now he played it's my move. I took the c-pawn, which is fine, protecting my c-pawn and also making his 2 pawns become seriously weakened. But he played the strong move b5. And although, it's actually, I say strong. It's strong in the sense that it should have saved the draw for him because it caused me to make a weak move. If I had done the right thing, white is winning easily here. So I guess you can't really call that move too strong. If the white thing is just simply to take the pawn. And the idea is that, he can attack it, say, there are a couple different lines of play, and I can defend it. But I have 2 passed pawns now in the b file and the g file, and he's going to have a hard time stopping both of them. The reason I didn't do this was because I was worried about the D pawn being taken, which I'll show here, and him sacking his rook for one of the pawns, and in the meantime being able to get his pawn escorted to safety. But it's really not a concern. So the reason is because my pawns are just too fast. You can check me, but I just go to where I'm continuing to advance the pawns, and these combination of the B and the G pawns will save the day, and he doesn't really have time to run his D pawn. I was afraid that if he ran his D pawn and I had to stop it with my rook, that he would win a pawn with his king and then sacrifice his rook for the other pawn, or something on that order. Actually, that doesn't make sense right now that I'm thinking about it, but it was some quick thinking and maybe not quite too accurate thinking in the time scramble. So after king f7, I went ahead and let him take my c pawn. Now the pawn advances. So from this point on, the computer thinks the game is dead drawn, 0.00. I thought I still had an advantage, and at one point Dave offered a draw after about 4 or 5 moves, and I refused it because I thought I had an advantage. But it turns out I really didn't. That it wasn't as good as I thought. But I'll show you the rest of the game here because you want to see the interesting occurrence near the end. So he pushed the c pawn. I pushed mine. He came over and checked me. Then he threatened to take my pawn. I went to where I could support it again. He checked me again. Then I blocked with the rook. And now this leads to us both getting queens. But with me having queen first, so I'm able to check him, and his king moves, and I win the c pawn, or the d pawn rather. And I thought, I realized that it's going to be hard to escape the perpetual checks. But I thought with the pawn advanced as it is, and his king back behind my pawn, that maybe I would be able to shelter and use my pawn as shelter and be able to advance it more. But I looked at these positions with Stockfish, and there was no win for white that I missed. So Dave just is able to check me from a variety of directions. He checked me on c8, and then he checked me on b7, and I played king to e6. And then he checked me again, and I didn't realize it was a check. And this is where some funny things happened. We were both under a minute at this point, and not realizing it was a check, I played my queen to b6, checking him. Once I did that, he said, "No, you're in check." So he stopped the clock and got George, the TD, who was not hard because everybody was clustered around the game at that point. So George was right there, and asked him to add the 2-minute penalty to Dave's clock that he gets for me making an illegal move. And we reset the queen back onto d6 and started the clock up again. And I played king to f6. And the problem is that, maybe you've already read it here in my notes, the problem is that this is a violation of the touch move rule. I didn't realize, or especially in time pressure, I didn't realize that that illegal move had constituted touching my queen, and that in this position, I have to move my queen. That's the only legal move. And so after I played king f6, Dave could say, "No, you touch the move, you have to move. You touch the queen, you have to move it," and we would replace it. He'd get another 2 minutes on his clock, and then I would have to play queen d7 to block the check. Is the only legal move, given that I have to move the queen. And then he could simply trade off the queens, and even I would have to agree this is a drawn game. So I it's too bad. I wasn't trying to cheat Dave here, but neither one of us saw this occurrence, and we only found out about it after the end of the game. Instead, what happened was something a bit bizarre. After I moved my king away, okay, he checked from another direction, and I moved my king. I'm just trying to find some way to get to where I can shelter it. He checked me again. I moved my king, trying to get to the short side of the board. I figured it might be a little easier to shelter over there. And then he made a really surprising move. Now, in this move, I let Stockfish run for a minute or two on my machine, which is pretty fast, and actually there are table bases that would tell me the same thing, but at 50 ply depth, 25 moves by each of us, it still doesn't see a win here for white. And so I'm pretty sure this is a win. I probably ought to check it on the table base since there are only 5 pieces. But instead, Dave hallucinated. Basically, he took my queen and I took back. And in his mind, he said, this is a drawn position. He has the opposition. But of course, the problem is that the white pawn is headed that way. It's not headed toward him. It's headed the other way. And so, after he moves off to the side and I move off to the side, there's no way to stop the march of this guy up to make a queen. And so that was kind of a sad ending for Dave. He fought a really good game. It was very even. There was that one little time where I had the advantage, where if only I'd been clever enough to get that G-pawn moving instead of blocking it with my king, back wherever that was, back here, I guess, then it would have been a fairly easy win, but I didn't see that. I really ought to work some more on my rook and pawn endgames, I guess. But it was interesting. We were the very last ones done, and in fact, we went longer than we had more time than the 200 minutes that were allotted because of the penalty minutes that were added on. But it was a fun game, and thanks to Dave, I'm sorry in a sense it turned out the way it did, but I've had the same things happen to me too. We all make those sorts of errors, especially when we're scrambling in time pressure. So until next week, this is me saying goodbye to you. Bye-bye.